This is often seen as a sensitive or an embarrassing subject for us.
But we know how important it is for young people to be able to talk to each other.
Our aim was to create a series of sessions where young people felt confident to have conversations about consent and relationships.
This is our film.
I think of consent as like a conversation and a mutual agreement that's setting boundaries.
In day-to-day life, it's just showing that you're okay and you know what's going to happen and you're also okay with that.
To me, consent means just mutual agreement. It doesn't have to mean in a sexual context. It just means two people or even more are okay to do something.
I think it's just like two people coming together and agreeing and just like being comfortable enough to do so. It just like, well, it doesn't have to do anything. Just be comfortable with each other.
I think people often hear that word and think of like always in a sexual context, but it's about like just keeping yourself comfortable and keeping yourself safe. And I think people often assume that it's something that happens once, but I view consent as an ongoing conversation.
It's like quite a scary word sometimes, because most times when you hear about it, it's in a negative context, but it also has like a lot of positives, and it's not just revolved around like sex and stuff. It can be about anything.
When I've had sort of sex education classes about consent, it's mainly been focused on like the sort of negative aspects of consent and like not what to do. I suppose it's also mainly focused on boys a lot more, I feel, than girls.
It's quite negative. It's not about, sex being an enjoyable thing or sex being a good thing. It's more about like, don't do this, don't get pregnant.
Consent isn't really like spoken about that often, and so there's a I feel like for some people they just don't understand.
It's always focused on the negatives of what men are doing and their consequences to their actions, whereas what women do to men, if men get upset by that, they're sort of seen as weak.
Like, at a younger age, we'd get kind of split off and it'd be like, oh, this is what a vagina is, this is what a willy is, come back together now. But now we do it as a group, which I do think is better, because I feel like sex education is about everyone and understanding everyone, and that's very important.
There's a saying of kind of keep your mates in line, and this was definitely directed just almost like male friendship groups, and it's up to you to make sure your friends are like sticking to the right path. It's slightly demonizing and kind of goes along in alignment with toxic masculinity and these kind of phrases which are very derogatory, and it can make a boy feel a lot worse, knock self-confidence, knock kind of maybe relationships and friendships, and yeah, that's kind of what I've experienced.
For example, a boy has wanted to, liked a girl or something, and then something's happened and the girl has been like, oh, well, I've like been harassed or something, and the boy didn't intend to do that, but it's just kind of like, it's not really taught like well enough for some boys to like really understand about like boundaries and sort of how to approach consent without it being uncomfortable for a girl as well. And sometimes people are just, too awkward, or they don't know what to say.
Yeah, it seems quite tough against particularly like young men, because while there's still this expectation that it's on them to pursue a female, and kind of, in that interaction, the onus is on the man to make the move, and then at the same time, if it's only ever the men having to make the moves, then it's very easy for a lot of girls to feel like they're being made moves on, but it's tricky both ways around.
When you hear about some of the stuff that happened in the news, and you're learning about it in class, and a lot of it's quite negative towards men, I feel like that could make you feel like intimidating maybe, which doesn't really, it's not good. Whereas it doesn't really go into women that commit like harassment and stuff. It doesn't really teach them that there'll be consequences for that.
I have had specific lessons recently about consent. You were told you were not allowed to take a step forward unless your partner gave you explicit consent using the word yes, or if it wasn't providing with consent, then using the word no. That exercise then moved on to non-verbal consent, using body language, gestures, and I think it was a really good real-life example of how easy it can be to provide someone with consent. However, these lessons were just providing consent in sexual contexts. I think that broadening that would be valuable for education.
I don't think I've properly been taught about consent, really. I think it's just about being meant to know what it is, and I've only had one really proper lesson.
My consent lessons have usually been geared towards negative things, so if you don't have consent, this is what happens, e.g. rape or pregnancy or STIs, and I think consent needs to be formed as a positive viewpoint. Of course these things can happen, but if you get consent you can enjoy yourself and you can, have sexual pleasure and talk about these things in an unstigmatised way. So.
Well, consent is ongoing, so I feel like when we talk about consent in an intimate situation, it should kind of be acknowledged that if one person consents to one thing once, they're not consenting to everything that happens after it, and that consent should continue throughout a relationship.
I think it's important that people understand that in an intimate situation that giving consent once isn't allowing everything going forward, and that it has to be ongoing. And that you can't just assume because you've done something once, you can't just do it again automatically.
Like, it might not be confirmed, but the way that they're acting can sort of be quite a good boost of confidence with what you're going to do. But it's always best to just check verbally as well, because if they're giving you the signs through the body, you could be misinterpreting it.
I think that some things that can get in the way of seeking consent are the obvious, intoxication, drugs, alcohol, but it's not as straightforward as that. I think a massive thing that's forgotten about is people who are perhaps neurodivergent or autistic or haven't had experience before or have watched porn and thought this is what it's meant to be like. So there's not one size fits all.
If they're drunk or whatever, you shouldn't go up and ask, because their headspace isn't clear. They would make a 100% decision and they might regret it, and that's not good.
I'd definitely say in all the lessons I have had, it's been about a worst case scenario where it's extreme lack of consent in a kind of situation. I don't think I've ever seen a scenario about where consent has gone right and where maybe two young people have both consented to something, talked about it, and then kind of ended on a good, positive note.
There are a lot of potential things that could get in the way of consent. Assuming that something is okay because that person's done it with somebody else, or maybe if they've got a negative reputation for doing something like slut-shaming women.
It's not necessarily just boys and girls, it's also men and men, women and women. But gender doesn't really matter in this situation. It's just as long as you know that what you're doing is okay with the other person, that's all that really matters.
Social stigma has a huge part to play in, whether someone's confident enough to actually ask for consent. Things that kind of change these expectations about asking for consent could be porn in young men. I think it's probably pretty popular, and I also think that a constant kind of being exposed to that, it could bring in an unrealistic expectation for a lot of young boys, and what they kind of imagine the scenario will be nothing what it's actually like. As long as you can communicate, I don't think there's a lot of that in these kind of videos or in the media that these people are watching.
I think in modern day society, especially at school, boys have a big pressure to be masculine, and I think that it's so important that boys are told that they don't have to believe these things and follow these people such as Andrew Tate.
Previous looks at masculinity have always been negative and derogatory, and no boy is going to want to feel like that. So when you have a role model who is expressing masculinity and saying this thing is good, and you know, like, I want to show it, and kind of giving people a voice that they might not have had before, can, because these people are probably quite vulnerable and they feel like they're missing something, he's giving them what they're missing, and then they're going to be drawn and they're going to kind of comply with the rest of his views because they like him and they see him as a strong model.
Part of it is definitely toxic masculinity, which affects boys and young men so much in modern day society, because of, you know, roots in the patriarchy of men needing to be strong, very masculine, not allowing to show emotions or any weakness. I think that provides such a easy way for bad role models to enter young men and young boys' lives.
You just need basically someone saying it's okay to be a man and it's okay to be masculine. You don't need any of the other stuff.
I think there are lots of things of how consent teaching can be improved. I think how to have consent, not how not to have consent, which is what I've experienced a lot of.
Either trying to teach parents how to be stronger role models for their children, and also from maybe a younger age go and not necessarily sex education, but teach young people more about what it is to respect each other.
Sex as a whole needs to be destigmatized, and definitely for women who I feel are often shamed. I've spoke about slut shaming before, but kind of shamed for sexual pleasure and things like that.
I think teaching people at younger ages would be really good, because just getting them to think about it.
Consent positively, talking about it in a positive frame of mind. Things are meant to be enjoyed, not meant to be, oh my gosh, I'm so scared about all these thoughts about my sexual situation, and it's meant to be, it's meant to be enjoyable.
I think, of course you want to have consent and you want to have safe sex, but I feel we shouldn't be making young people, and especially young women, so afraid of pleasure and of sex.
Another way that the system could be improved is we need more education on the dangers of the porn industry, for everybody really, because everyone consumes it. And while I do think young men and boys are targeted by it, that does not mean that they're the only people who need educating on it.
There's such a nervous kind of stigma in secondary schools about intimacy and relationships. I feel like that is probably because of a lack of it previously in earlier life, and if this is just kind of more of a normalised process, I think that kind of is the only way, if not the best way, that you're kind of going to make a real positive change to it.
Okay to do something.
I think it's just two people coming together.
I agree with Meg that it was really interesting to see the two perspectives and how actually, there's not so much different between boys and girls, which is sort of, like you were saying, separated.
Yeah.
When you talked about consent, it's all like boys and girls, and it's actually, you all have the same motive. You want to have a good time, you want to be safe.
Brilliant.
We had very, very similar views on the subject. I think there wasn't really any difference on what we were, boys and girls, were saying about it.
I know how I feel I'm treated as a woman, but I don't know how, men feel like they're treated as a man, so I feel it's interesting to hear it from someone else's point of view, because you only kind of know it from your own.
Even though when you're not with each other, boys and girls, the views can seem quite different, but actually when you're all in the room together and talking about it, a lot of the views are actually pretty similar, but it's just in society there's such a big divide, you would just assume that their opinions would be different, when actually when you just talk about it then you might come together more than you'd expect.